This is a Gamo2 FauceTwo arcade controller. It exists for one reason, and one reason only, to play the Konami arcade game, Sound Voltex. So, why did I buy a whole controller just to play a niche game that most people have never heard of? Well, recently I've been going to my local Round 1 to try out some rhythm games that I know of but haven't played myself. Sound Voltex is probably my favorite of the ones I've tried. It's not all that convenient to go out to an arcade every time I want to play though, and you can get it on PC. So I tried it out at home using my keyboard. And it was playable, sure, but something was wrong. I wasn't having nearly as much fun as I did in the arcade. Eventually, I realized that the controller was the missing key. And so here I am, with an impractical hunk of plastic on my desk. This is just the most recent in a long line of controllers that I've tried and owned. I'm a little obsessed. They fascinate me, because different controllers entirely change the way we play games, sometimes drastically. I'm sure some of you are already nodding your heads in agreement at their importance, but for those who aren't, let me explain myself. If you play games, I think it's a safe bet that you're familiar with one of these. This style of controller has essentially been the standard since the PlayStation Dual Analog controller released in 1997. And for good reason. They're incredibly versatile, with a combination of inputs that allows a large variety of games to be played using a single device. Some of this may be an inverse effect of this style of controller being the standard, and therefore games are designed with them in mind, but I think there's still something to be said about how different these games can be. And as a result of their ubiquity, many people grow used to using them. Of all the reasons people use the controllers they do, the most common is probably familiarity. It just makes sense that people would prefer using whatever they're accustomed to. People that have played primarily on console will probably mostly use standard controllers. And people that are used to mouse and keyboard will probably continue to use mouse and keyboard, regardless of what the game itself says. For a long time, I was a gamepad enjoyer and would just use whatever controller came with the console I was playing on. But I eventually began to broaden my horizons, and it's actually thanks to this, the PlayStation Vita. The exact moment that caused me to shift in this direction happened while playing a little forgotten indie gem, Final Fantasy VI. The game brought a lot of unique ideas to the table, one being that the character Sabine? I don't know, has command inputs. In order to pull off his stronger attacks, you have to first press multiple directions, kind of like in a fighting game. I eventually noticed that I could tell when I passed or failed the input before the game let me know. Because, unlike the DualShock 4, the Vita's D-pad has clear tactile feedback. When you press a direction, you can feel and hear a click. And when I felt the wrong amount of clicks, I knew that the move was not going to come out. This single discovery began to change how I thought about controllers entirely, and I gradually became interested in trying different ones. But for a while, I didn't really act on that interest and continued to use what I had. That is, until I stumbled across Hatsune Miku Project Diva MegaMix. On a whim, I bought this game during a sale, and proceeded to play it way too much. To this day, Project Diva is still my favorite rhythm game. I found it fun from the start, but initially something felt slightly off about how it played. This game was designed for arcades, and the cabinet has a very different layout from the DualShock 4 controller I was using. It's obvious that while the controls work for the DualShock, the game wasn't built for it. The console version went so far as to add macro options to make certain button combinations more reasonable to pull off. I tried a lot of different methods of controlling the game on DualShock 4, and even picked up separated D-pad buttons from Battle Beaver in order to reduce missed clicks. But it still didn't feel fully right to me. Eventually though, I decided to pick up the Gamo2 K28, and everything clicked into place. Since I could use more fingers, it became easier to hit triple notes with one hand. I could play individual slide notes with my thumbs without having my other fingers leave the regular keys, and the feeling of pressing the tactile switches was way better than pressing the DualShock's buttons. This is a perfect example of the way intuitiveness affects how a controller feels. If a control scheme doesn't come together entirely, even if the game is fun, it won't realize its full potential. I actually got to a point where I didn't want to play MegaMix without the K28, which was a problem when I learned that it had a technical issue, where it pulled inputs at a low rate. When I ran into a wall in the game, I wasn't sure whether the issue was because of me or my controller. Recently, Hatsune Miku Project Diva MegaMix Plus released on PC though. Now that the game had keyboard support, I could just use my daily driver custom mechanical keyboard instead. And it turns out, I just suck. In retrospect, this was probably obvious. Still though, with more customization options for both my keyboard and for the in-game controls, I'm excited to be able to play MegaMix again. But while I moved away from Project Diva, I went through a variety of other kinds of games. And for a bit there, I got back into first-person shooters for the first time in a while. At first, I was using an Xbox-style controller with back paddles. But I wanted to learn something that would give me more control over my aim. It's not that I think controllers aren't viable or anything. I mean, have you heard Apex players complain about aim assist? But I really wanted to try something that allowed me to have more precision. I gave gyro controls a shot, but they felt really weird and I had a hard time configuring them properly, so I gave up. And since I had always wanted to learn mouse and keyboard, I decided to switch over. The only problem is that I like almost nothing about the keyboard part of mouse and keyboard. Moving with WASD feels terrible to me. Some keys can only be accessed by moving your fingers from your movement options, and I don't like having to stretch my pinky more than necessary. There's only so much that changing keybinds can fix, so I decided to try out an Azeron Compact controller. This is a fully remappable, highly adjustable keyboard controller with an analog stick. Its main selling point is its ergonomics. I have a few qualms with it, mainly the height it sits off the desk and its somewhat awkward stick position, but overall I find it much more comfortable to play on than a normal keyboard. The minimal distance needed to get any inputs makes it require much less hand movement. Ergonomics are one of the most important factors in why you should or shouldn't use any controller. Things that feel weird, uncomfortable, or even painful are usually not worth doing in my opinion. Why give yourself RSI by using something that just doesn't work for your hands? Speaking of not working for your hands, for a while now the genre I've played the most of is fighting games, and recently I picked up one of these. This is a Snackbox Micro, a type of leverless or button box controller. It's designed to be a variant on the arcade stick, but instead of using a lever, it has 4 buttons that each represent a different direction. In a way, it's very similar to playing on keyboard. It even uses hot swappable Kale Chalk switches instead of traditional arcade buttons. I've wanted to try this controller out for a while, but I'm not sure whether I can keep using it. Every time I do, my hands feel like they're going to fall off. I plan to keep giving it a shot, though definitely more slowly and carefully. This goes against what I just said about ergonomics and comfort being important, but there's a big reason I'm still interested: for the performance advantage. These controllers are very strong in particular ways, so much so that they've been controversial among fighting game players for years. Because of their unique button layout, these types of controllers allow for opposite directions to be pressed simultaneously, which in some older games can totally break the rules of the genre, allowing things like guarding in both directions at once. To fix that, these controllers now have built-in cleaning of opposite directions on a hardware level. There are multiple versions of this SOCD cleaning, but the standard is for right and left to be neutral and for up and down to be up. This, combined with the input readers in games, causes there to be a lot of useful shortcuts to performing motions for different moves. One that works in all games is this Dragon Punch shortcut I use. It's much faster and easier for my hands to pull off than trying to do a normal DP motion. But the reason I want to use this controller is not for the shortcuts, but rather for its precision. I normally use pad to play fighting games, and I prefer ones with a Sega Saturn style layout. I like the feel of doing motions on the circular D-pad and the consistency of being able to have all of the attack buttons on the face of the controller. All of these controllers have had slight issues for me though, and on the one I've used the most, the Power A Fusion Fight Pad, That issue is accidental jumps. The D-pad on this is fine for when I'm on offense, but when I'm defending, I'll often accidentally go past just holding back when trying to block high, and get hit out of my jump instead. This is an absolute non-issue on Snackbox. Since jump is an entirely separate button, you can't overshoot and hit it. This precision applies for other things as well. There's less of a distance to travel to press any given button, which can save time on reactions and make actions like walking and blocking more seamless. Button box may be an FGC specific discussion, but you can see similar concerns over the performance advantages for different controllers in a lot of genres. I mentioned earlier that some mouse and keyboard Apex players complain about pad. In close quarters scrambles, aim assist can help improve your ability to properly locate and hit your opponents. I even saw a discussion recently in OSU surrounding analog keyboards, and a feature that allows for the actuation point of the keys to adjust dynamically. This minimizes the distance your fingers have to travel to hit stream notes, which can improve players' abilities to pull them off consistently. In almost all debates like this though, there are downsides that come with the benefits of controversial controllers. In the case of the button box, this downside is that it loses some of the intuitiveness of other controllers. While individual inputs are more precise, you also have to be much more accurate in how you input them to get the outcome you want. Trying to do certain motions is much more easy to mess up, and thanks to the cleaning the controller does, is also less likely the game will be able to interpret your mistakes properly and have the move you were trying for come out. Dealing with this, on top of it straining my hands, has made me slowly move back to pad primarily. I'll still try to practice on the Snackbox occasionally, but I don't want to force it too much. And to be honest, I still prefer pad in a lot of ways. The primary being that it's so satisfying to use. Motions and actions just feel right, which makes playing really fun. And that brings us back right to where we started. Just like how playing on pad feels right for fighting games, using a specialized controller feels right for playing Sound Voltex. In each respective case, they just feel the most fun to use. One of the most interesting aspects of arcade games is their ability to use unique control setups, since the player doesn't have to supply the controller. Sound Voltex takes full advantage of this, enhancing what is essentially a standard 4-key rhythm game layout with the addition of thumb buttons and knobs. Those additions make the game very kinetic, with a lot of cool hand movements and tricky patterns to learn. Playing the game on keyboard works, and is actually better since you never have to take your fingers off the keys replacing the knobs, meaning you never have to play sections one-handed and don't run the risk of making a mistake while moving your hands between the different control types. Honestly, I'm starting to think that keyboard is a technically superior input for a lot of games. But this comes at the cost of it not feeling nearly as satisfying to use. Trying to further break down why this controller is more fun to me isn't really so clear though. Maybe it's partially because I was more familiar with the arcade control scheme already. Maybe it's also partially because using the knobs on a controller is more intuitive than using the keys on a keyboard. The different factors I've laid out so far often blend together. I not only wanted the improved comfortability of the Azeron, but wanted a control method that would allow me to use a mouse with the addition of an analog stick for movement, since that's what I'm used to. And while I have played Project Diva in the arcade, I didn't find it to be so fun that I immediately went out to buy a controller to use at home or anything. Not only did I find keyboard to be very intuitive for the game, but I'm more familiar with it than I am the arcade layout. That said, this could change with time, and I do want to keep trying out the arcade version of the game to see if I get more used to it. There are so many factors that can play into controller preferences, and it's not always clear what's the best option for you until you go out and try different things. So, am I saying you should go out right now and buy the most expensive, fanciest controller you can get your hands on? No. I actually probably have too many controllers. But I think experimenting is exciting and can help maximize the entertainment you get out of any given game. You can try a new controller, try a different button mapping, or even create your own custom controller. The reasons I listed here cover a lot of the motivating factors that may make a specific option appealing, but I'm absolutely sure there's more. You may already know what you value, and if not, it's worth exploring a bit to find what's out there. There's so many options, and in my book, it only makes sense to chase down the way to play that appeals the most to you.